Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's Christian Formation Time here at Messiah Lutheran Church in Mechanicsville, Virginia, for those watching at home, if you didn't know already. We are glad to be together this weekend. We know that it is Memorial Day weekend, and we are here this weekend knowing that a lot of other folks are traveling for the holiday weekend, and we also know that a lot of folks are taking time this weekend to honor those who gave their lives to protect the country, and we are thankful for that sacrifice. We continue to read our book that's set in a different kind of war zone. This book that's set in Los Angeles during the height of gang violence in the 80s and 90s, called Tattoos on the Heart, written by Father Gregory Boyle, founder of Homeboy Industries. We've been going through this one chapter at a time. This week we are on chapter 4, which is called Water, Oil, Flame, and it is a reference to um, the symbols and the things that are used as a part of a baptism ceremony. Water to baptize, the flame of the candle, the oil to anoint and make that sign of the Holy Spirit. So he doesn't really talk a lot about the sacrament of baptism in this chapter, but how I take it is how in that sacrament of baptism, there is a sacredness, not only of the ceremony, but also that declaration of the sacredness of the person being baptized as the sign is drawn, you are marked with the cross of Christ and sealed with the Holy Spirit. So there's this sense of sacredness being, if not bestowed, then declared in the baptism ceremony. And I think what this chapter does is it takes some of these gang members who are trying to get out of that gang life, or before they leave the gang life, really. I think that's the big point of this chapter is Father Gregory, trying to bestow this or name this or bring to light this sacredness so that if they feel it, then that'll change their lives. Sometimes he helps, sometimes they get there on their own. But that's the theme this week. A quick recap from last week, if you weren't here in person or online. Hello. We talked about compassion, and just a few highlights from what we talked about last time are one of the refrains was being in the world who God is, that we're called to be those ambassadors for Christ, like Paul talked about in 2 Corinthians, that we are trying to be in the world who God is. There was a little bit about the difference between sympathy, empathy, and compassion. Sympathy, feeling bad for something somebody else is going through. Empathy. Sorry, you just off screen. We just had some donuts slide across the table. Somebody stop. Yeah. Yeah, we got food in person. Try this again. Yeah, here we go. There you go. Empathy, feeling what the other person is feeling because you know what it is your own self. But then compassion, there's this moment as he's talking about this in a class he's teaching in a prison, Folsom prison, and one of the inmates says, "Compassion is God," and that's what we're trying to embody by following Christ. We had the story both in class and in my sermon last week about when they took in immigrants, undocumented immigrants, to let them sleep in the church, homeless folks, how somebody spray painted wetback church on the steps of the church. And some of the ladies in the church said, "No, don't just paint over it. If that's how they see us, then that's what we'll be. We'll be proud to be called that." But then the smell lingered in the sanctuary from the folks that had slept there. And long story short, talked about embracing someone else's odor as your own. And I said, substitute that word odor for burden, pain, whatever it might be. So take on somebody else's stuff as your own. He talked about ripping the roof off the place. There was the Bible story that he cited about the friends who brought their paralyzed friend to see Jesus, but the crowd was so big that they had to tear a hole in the roof and lower him down for healing. And he said not only was there healing, but it was the folks that were on the outs coming in. And that by the end, that the goal for Christ would be that no one would be left outside. And then he talked about dissolving the myth that we are separated at all. We didn't talk about this story last week, but there was the story about the young man named Anthony who wanted to be a mechanic. And so he went to his mechanic dentist who just smoked all the time and never talked, never smiled. He's like, hey, can you teach him what you know? He wants to do this. Dennis just nods his head. And by the end, Dennis is smiling and they transformed each other. So by taking on somebody else into your life and their experience, it changes you too. And so it dissolves the myth that we are separate at all. And a couple of the discussion questions I asked folks to ponder during the week were, how willing is the average Christian to see ourselves as in kinship or as equals with those on the margins? So not just we're doing nice things for them, but we're actually in this together. And another one was, have you ever embraced someone else's odor as your own? Like maybe you didn't, maybe they weren't even a family member. You had no obligation to deal with this person or their problems, but you did. So any other thoughts on those questions, things you thought about during the week or on last week's chapter as a whole, since you've had a week to marinate? Compassion.
With the first question, it brings to mind to me something I wanted to see happen for a long time, is a way for the individual congregations to support themselves and take part in it, to be able to invite the people to their congregation, whether it's for a meal or a play date outside or service or celebration, whatever. I would love to see us be able to work out a way.
We have every church's brochure. We have been, because we have so many different religions, we don't push any religion, not encourage any church to, because we all different.
That's right. But there are many people who don't have a religion who might be willing and don't believe in religion.
Invitation.
I think it's an invitation, and if the invitation is there, there's always a possibility someone might come join. Noticed several churches, I think it's up and down Apple, that say, welcome and you are invited.
Yeah.
It's difficult to walk into
Yes.
place. No.
Yes, it is.
There was a couple that walked in last week. They may have been, but I didn't recognize them, and I am always like so encouraged by that because, but I think, wow, this thing's great, and the good people of Messiah recognize that people are new and greet them warmly and make people welcome, which is wonderful. Love is kind of the message, right? But what I find remarkable about this guy's ministry, and it's gotten me to thinking about us as as a congregation, is that he reached out and saw their need and helped. My sister-in-law was telling me that the congregation in Randallstown, Maryland, they had space there. It's a huge old church, and she's like, open. So I guess there's some good to being small, right? But they would rent space to Al-Anon and Narconon, because that in that community is very impoverished community. It's right outside Baltimore. Those are needs that they were able to fulfill, and they had a really wonderful feeding for a while, for a long time actually, before the pandemic, I think started that. But pastor challenged council to think about what the needs are on campus, and because we kind of we're still kind of living in an isolated way, exact needs are, but we know that people are lonely, and we know that people have addictions, and we know that the isolation of the pandemic has exacerbated that, and maybe we need to think about inviting groups that support to use our facilities, and then just us loving them, and perhaps that will that brings them into the fold. All right, I'm sorry.
You're fine. I remember something I did. It was sort of an exercise, but it ended up being very meaningful. It was a prayer walk. It was supposed to help you get to know your neighborhood better. And Messiah isn't really in a neighborhood. We have houses and things around us, but you walk around your own neighborhood or somewhere around the vicinity of the church, and you look around with eyes of prayer, like what houses are brand new, which things are falling into disrepair. How many people did you see? Were there kids? Were there elderly? Like, what do you see? And pray about those things as you go. And if it's tricky because you can't just. I've used this example before. We can't use a field of dreams model. You can't say, well, if we build it or if we program it, then people will come. I've tried that before. It doesn't usually work. But so we got to get out there somehow and get to know the needs, invite people in, and we could go to MSEF and invite people, but that's tricky. And I was just talking with the Huberts the other day about other things that we could do, and they said pretty much people know what they need and what they want to get. They come and they get it and they go. They're not looking for anything else. So how do we get not just Messiah Lutheran, but Christianity out there saying we're here for you? Because a lot of times he's just sitting in his office and people know who he is. And some of the stories this week are folks that never wanted anything to do with him, turned him down over and over again, and then 10, 15 years later they show up because they know that he'd be there. So how do we build that reputation and that welcome and that invitation in the community so that folks know we're here? Because I mean, that's not going to grow the budget. It's not going to grow the attendance, but that's not our main goal. We got
It
to.
was good that Parks and Rec is coming.
Yeah, it is. Yeah,
It- We don't get any members from or anything,
No.
but the building is.
exactly.
used.
Yeah, that's
Right.
part of the blessing of having a building is that you can let other folks benefit from it.
It's not to get the members, it's to share the love.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's, may give us something along with the opportunity to share.
I'm hopeful. Yeah. So now that everybody's here, we've got some repairs going on. We went to close the door and it kind of got stuck, but I forgot to spin the computer. Well, it got repaired once, so it's still going. But I didn't do this, so Roger's over there fixing that. But a lot of our regulars, there we go. So the folks at home know there are people who are actually talking and here sitting at the table. It's not bots, okay? This week's chapter, Water, Oil, and Flame. One of the lines that kind of stuck out for me is that, folks come by to get their fix. Even after they've gone out of Homeboy Industries and they don't need that anymore, they still come back to stop in to get their fix. Well, fix of what? Love, This is where they met acceptance and community. And he said, community, where everybody's there for you, is always going to trump the gang culture, where it's always, one step out of line, you're going to get it.
That reminded me of even coming up from teaching. How many kids you have come back
Mhm.
year after year to see you and to check in. And it's just evidently it was something that there were some good memories there somewhere, and there were bad memories there.
Yes.
Great things.
And I don't know if because I work with adolescents largely, often the kids that come back are the ones that had a lot of challenges. And, I'm fairly, I'm somewhat firm, children, firm, fair, and friendly, but, so that doesn't always please them when they're young, or when they're struggling. But my mom always said, I believe it's true, the children need boundaries and they crave boundaries. There's one kid I had last year I actually thought was so difficult, but he's one who's come back to see me, and I'm pleased to see him. I think the fact that I cared enough to try to challenge him to find, to be a better person, to find the goodness in himself from this chapter, you know what I mean? Meant a lot to him because he had been written off by his peers, he'd been written off by many teachers. He was very bright. His mother was interesting. And, he didn't have stability. So, I actually am kind of sad that I'm not in the same place so that he can continue to come back. I hope I'll see him sometime. I will never forget that kid. There's a lot of kids, the good ones even, that you go, oh, I know this kid was a sweetheart, I can't remember his name. I will never forget certain children.
If you stick with somebody, even if they're pushing back, even if they resent the conditions, they'll remember that because you stuck with them. Reading Harry Potter with Kate right now. The older two have been through it. And this is such a dumb little detail in the books, but one of the characters goes to visit the giants, and they're terrible and they're bad. But they show up, and he says, "Here, we bring you a gift. We'll be back tomorrow. We'll bring you another one." And they leave. And the people he's talking to are like, "Well, wait, you just left? Like, why didn't you work with them? We need to win them over." And he said, "Well, because if you do something small and then leave and make that promise and then come back the next day and show that you're trustworthy, then that's going to build a lot of stuff. So if you say, hey, I'm not going to let you get away with this, but I'm going to stick with you." And that's something I wanted to talk about this. We're all over the place. That's something I wanted to talk about this week in this chapter was the idea of cheap grace. Has anybody ever heard of cheap grace? Okay, so cheap grace would be when you talk about grace and forgiveness so much that it basically comes across as do whatever you want, God will forgive you. So it's grace without any kind of conditions, any kind of expectations. Paul talks about that in a few of his letters, like, so, well, since we're forgiven, should we sin more? No, that's not how it works. So we get a lot of stories of forgiveness and grace in here, and he doesn't go into the rules as much, but clearly none of this is cheap grace. He expects them to work and to show up on time. He'll give second chances, but there will be consequences. If you cross the line, one of the stories, there was a woman who got fired multiple times because she kept messing up, starting fights, showing up on drugs, things like that. So I wanted to just say that just because this is a book full of compassion and grace doesn't mean it's cheap grace. And that's something that Lutherans flirt with sometimes, because we're always about
been accused of it.
Yeah, and so you have to be careful not to fall into that. The first one I wanted to read is from near the end. It's page. Oh, the sneeze went away. Good. It's from page 105. That's where we start. So to set this up, Father Gregory receives lots of awards over the course of his career. A lot of people want to honor him, give him recognitions and awards and plaques. And he's like, I never keep these things. He says, I always usually give them to whoever was the last one in the car when I'm dropping off. Because he usually brings employees of Homeboy Industries success stories with him to tell their stories, so folks can see what it's about. So there's one where he couldn't make it. He was double booked. So he asked this 18-year-old Elias to go accept the award on his behalf. He's like, just write a couple paragraphs, say what the Homeboy Industries has done for you, and thank them on my behalf. So he gets there, and Elias is freaking out. He's so nervous to speak in front of these people. And picking it up in the middle of the page, 105. Once they get to the auditorium, things move from bad to worse. The place is packed. Standing room only. Flop sweat dots Elias's forehead. The MC says, accepting the award on behalf of Father Greg Boyle is Elias Montes. The crowd claps warmly as Elias awkwardly makes his way to the podium, bathed in a spotlight. He's trembling as he holds the yellow-lined paper on which he's written his speech. It's not much of a speech, really. There is no poetry, only the unmistakable testimony of this kid standing there, transformed and astonishing. The audience seems to get this on the first bounce. He gets to the end with a big finish. Because Father Greg and Homeboy Industries believed in me, I decided to believe in myself. And the best way I can think of paying him back is by changing my life. And that's exactly what I've decided to do. Thank you. The auditorium erupts in applause. They truly go nuts. They are on their feet and people are crying and shouting. Folks are locating their Kleenex and will not stop clapping. Elias finds his seat. Kara from their office is standing next to him, crying a great deal, but so is the man on the other side of Elias. The ovation continues, and Elias is quite oblivious to it all. Finally, he leans into Kara, who is still standing and applauding with the others, and whispers, "Sure, clapping a lot for G." Kara crouches toward him. "Oye, Minso, they're not clapping for G, they're clapping for you." Elias straightens as if connected to a power plant. "Nuh-uh," he says. "Yeah, huh," Kara says. "They are clapping for you." And so an entire room of total strangers hands Elias back to himself and says in no uncertain terms, "Don't move." "Don't move" is a reference to an earlier story where this kid comes in to draw him, and he's laughing so much at how serious this kid is that he shows him the picture and it's horrible, and he's like, "Whoa, that doesn't really look like me." He's like, "Well, I told you not to move." So God's saying, don't move. Like I right as you are, right where you are, I already love you. And that's what his speech said. It's like they believed in me until I could believe in myself. That I think is kind of the theme of this chapter, is loving somebody, believing in somebody, accepting somebody until they get to the same place that God sees them and the way you're treating them. And it's not cheap grace. It doesn't mean that they never have to change, never have to atone for mistakes or anything like that. That's why I wanted to bring in cheap grace. It just means God already loves you right where you are as you are. And then you go on from there. But that's the start. Is that how you have always perceived the church or God in your life? That you're good as you are, and then God will go from there? Or did you feel something different?
I had a really old pastor when I was really young, and it was much more the strict, but, I love history and psychology and sociology, and as a result, I can essentially start
Sure.
perspectives, like Pastor Bitter was probably is older than my parents. So he may have even served for, in the war in World War I or World War II. Anyway, he put the fear of death into me, I mean, and to all of us. And then we got this new pastor who was very imperfect. But he was younger, he was like my mother's age, and things changed. You talk about cheap grace. I even remember, paying attention enough to be like, he's kind of saying that you can do whatever you want, which was so different as and anyway, but yeah, no, I don't think I learned to feel that God loves me just the way I am until maybe, my 50s. Seriously, always, and you always start to get better.
Right.
But
Yeah, Jesus always starts with repent, turn back to God, turn away from these bad things. But he doesn't wait for you to reach the threshold of holiness before he comes up to you to say, "Hey, you should repent, come with me." I saw a couple other nodding heads there. What message did you hear, if it wasn't you're good where you are right now? You're loved where you are right
I've talked about my pastor from Florida before.
Yeah.
Pastor Bob, who happened to grow up at First English. He was just years ahead of me. He told us one day of how he was rather wild and young and in high school. He did not have a father. He had a stepfather. And I don't think there was any great love there. From what Mr. Bob said. He got in some trouble. He was running around with some guys when he was in high school, and they decided they were going to be really cute and put nickels on the streetcar track. And they did, not thinking about what was going to happen. And he and the other guys were, I'm guessing, juvenile detention somewhere. But Dr. Shera, who had helped start that church, and the Sunday school superintendent, Mr. Rustan, I remember these people like they're sitting here today, went down to the juvenile detention and saw Pastor Bob and vouched for him and took him under their wing. And he said all of a sudden the desire to be in Sunday school in church every Sunday was so much greater than it had ever been in his life.
Yeah.
And he said, they truly saved my life, and here I am now preaching. It was a very good story to think that you're going through such disaster and have no feeling for yourself or your self-worth. And that corresponds to me and my Emily. She has no idea that she has any worth, and we just keep working on it.
That takes me to a quote from here. It says, why not, or he's talking about when he would try to scare people straight, like one of their friends was killed in a gang shooting or something. And he'd go up to them at the funeral and say like, hey, I don't want to see you in that coffin. You need to get past 16. And their usual response wasn't, you're right, I got to change my life. It was usually like, well, I mean, why not? You got to die sometime. And he said, there is the language of the despondent for whom both hope and one's own sacredness is entirely foreign. So it's, a lot of the vocal churches do have that message of straighten up, shape up or ship out, stop doing these things, and then God will. It's in that order. As opposed to trying to get somebody to be like, no, you're sacred. God loves you. If you catch God peeking at you, God's going to be smiling from the earlier chapter, like you are loved. Let's live into that and let that be the one thing that makes you want to change your life and change your decision. Luther talked about law and gospel. There's the law that convicts you and drives you to your knees to seek God's grace and forgiveness. And you say like, man, I'm low. But then I think there's also the power of the gospel to lead with forgiveness and grace to the point where people get this sort of pit of their stomach light bulb epiphany of, I've really been horrible and I need to change my life. I didn't realize it until I saw what could be. It could go both ways, and that's why Luther said there's both, because God uses both the law to convict us, the gospel to free us, however it takes to change our hearts and wake us up. Let me do one other passage and we'll just open it up. Page 103. This was the story of Fabian, who was just this quirky guy with a crazy sense of humor. And he had this knack for bringing former gang enemies together and working with them. And he'd start to take care of them. If one was in the hospital, even an enemy, he'd start walking around the hospital and make sure they'd stay safe, that nobody else was showing up. And it says, the end of the story, he's in a car with a bunch of his friends, gang members, and they're like, oh, we see Froggy, he's our enemy. Let's just, let's take him out. And top of page 103, Fabian works his magic. Kick back, you guys, that's my primo. Sadio, he's your cousin? Yeah, that's my Tia's son. The car swerves back into morning traffic. Froggy was an enemy Fabian had come to know from our office. They're not related, they weren't cousins. He doesn't know how he managed it. With more mystery than I can explain away, Fabian locked onto the singularity of that love that melts you. It doesn't melt who you are, but who you are not. Turns out he wasn't all the abuse he endured. He was something else, astonishing and glorious. It's such a short little button on the end of that story, but it hits me so powerfully. First, that encountering God's love doesn't melt you, it melts away who you're not to get to who God sees you as. And that you're not all the abuse you endured. And how many folks talk about like a disease they have, oh, my diabetes, or something like that, or how many folks get so wrapped up in the pain and the stuff they've experienced in life that becomes who they are, and that sacredness is foreign to them. You are not the abuse you endured. It's really easy to look at somebody in dire straits. I mean, we had that conversation the other day. There was somebody sleeping outside, and the thought that came to our mind was, but for the grace of God go I. Well, that's true, but this guy still has God's grace too. So how do we communicate that to folks who are down and out, and to everybody at this table, that that's not who they are. Their circumstances don't define them. How do you see them through God's eyes? I have talked enough. Are there other stories or snippets from this chapter that stood out for you all?
There was a quote, the monastic, the highest, whatever of monks.
Page 86.
What is it?
Page 86.
Yeah. Yes,
Down at the bottom.
the highest form of sanctity is to live in hell and not lose hope. I was reviewing this, because as I told you guys, I read the whole thing all at once, so like, more prepared. But that really sounds with me, that, there's so many troubles in the world, but hope is so, without hope, you have nothing. I'll tell you one little personal story. I had a girlfriend who did die of breast cancer, but while she was going through treatment, she founded her, she had all the surgeries, but it was a genetic breast cancer. And all of a sudden, we were in the hospital. It was like the last really good conversation I had. And it was about hope. It's like, it's like, no, without hope, nothing. There's a Henry Nouwen quote that says, hope is able to see God's guiding hand, not only pleasant moments, but also in the shadows of darkness and despair. And it kind of speaks to that, and I think that's a challenge that we all face in the world today, is holding on to hope when there aren't solutions and there's so many problems that are so entangled,
On page 89 in the middle of the chapter, I thought there was an interesting sentence that says, in fact, gang members form an exclusive club of young people playing their game.
Yeah.
What a terrible way to think.
If you don't think,
beyond
right,
today.
can't think beyond the circumstances.
I don't know, I think it was in this chapter, I don't remember the thing about the girls wanting to have kids because
It was
really young.
Yeah.
Was it because
Yeah.
they expect to die young? I'm like,
Yeah.
that is just, like not at all what I think about when I think about having children, but how sad that is,
Yeah, it's on the next page. If you don't believe you will reach 18, then you accelerate the whole process and you become a mother well before you're ready. And he says that with it in general, like you accelerate all the things that you shouldn't have to deal with until you're older because you don't think you're going to make it to that. It goes.
There's a comment on television 2 or 3 weeks ago where they were interviewing a bunch of kids in Los Angeles. And the comment was that they didn't expect to be that good past 19.
Right.
So everything goes.
Yeah. Yeah. If you don't feel like you're going to make it that far and you don't feel like if you feel like you're worthless or that there's no escape from the life you're stuck in, then yeah.
And who are you leaving this child with? Take care
That's
of
what
them.
breaks my heart.
Well, yeah, but I mean, and then that goes to it's how it becomes generational. Their parents weren't there, or something happened, and on and on. And so again, you can't just look at these folks and be like, oh well, what a bunch of losers, or what a bunch of deadbeats. Like, no, they're loved in God's eyes, and they're more than just the things they're dealing with or what's been handed to them. How do you see it that way? How do you see them that way, and how do you treat them so that they could maybe see themselves that way too? And then alongside it, give opportunities. Like he wasn't just going around the ghetto going, hey, you're great. Then he would have these jobs and like put his money where his mouth is.
I think it was in this chapter, maybe it's in chapter before, where the TV guy, what's his name, was
Mike
interviewing
Wallace,
him,
yeah.
and he made a comment he did not like and did not trust rich white guys.
Yeah.
And I think it was a couple years ago, but I still remember a client came in to MSTEP and made a comment, and we were helping them about, well, all of us volunteers lived in nice homes,
It
And
goes
you
both
know, you
ways.
wonder, we do-gooders, sometimes that's what that's the picture these people have. Oh, you're just coming in here to the Band-Aid, or, you know, you go home and do your fancy house, which is not necessary.
You're doing this with yourself,
But I wonder how often a lot of people who try to help do think of this.
Sure. And if that's what their interactions have been, if that's all, or what they've been told, then that's all. It goes both ways. It's so easy to just pigeonhole people and say that's who you are, as opposed to trying to see them through God's eyes.
I was watching
Either direction.
a video on YouTube, and my wife doesn't understand why I do it. I do it every once in a while. And they got these reactions to videos. And this one black guy hears, he's supposed to listen to the Righteous Brothers. And so first of all, he assumes that they're brothers. Second of all, he assumes that they're black because the song they're going to sing. And he caught a lot of flack because immediately as soon as it comes up white guys, he couldn't. He blew a fuse, basically.
Yeah.
And so he got a lot of criticism about that because to him, everybody thought that was a racist comment. And he just said, "Oh, that wasn't racist." He says,
Yeah.
I just shocked that about 20 of the guys that had so much soul in their song they were singing. They were going to be,
Sure.
because it blacked out first when the light came on, the white guys.
Yeah.
But it sucked.
Does anybody watch The Voice singing competition?
Yeah.
So there's a ton of singing competitions, but what makes The Voice kind of fun and special is in the first round, the judges have their backs to the singers. So it really is just judging them on their voice. And if they like them, they want them on their team, they'll hit their butt and the chair spins around. I can't tell you how many times they'll spin around and they'll go, what? Like, because it doesn't fit their expectation of who they think that voice is coming from. And they'll say it. I thought you were a man. I thought you were a woman. I thought you were white. I thought you were black. They'll just shoot it out there. And they're like, I never thought something that deep and soulful could come out of a 16-year-old or whatever. And so it's a singing competition. It's not the Bible. But it'll teach you some things about preconceptions and things like that. And then, of course, it turns into the normal reality show machine. Crank them out, sell some records. But the first part is
But what it does, I think it's a good clinical analysis of human nature.
Sure.
We stereotype before we know what we're looking at.
Oh gosh, yes. Yeah. And so yeah, that's one of the unique things about Greg is he just goes in and takes people where they're at. I've got one more I want to do, but any others? Oh, I discovered, by the way, just to say, the books that we ordered were used. I should have said that. Saved us a bit. But on page 108, I found some notes that somebody else did, all this ink. So now I've got like somebody else's notes through the rest of the book. So that was a surprise. I don't know why they didn't start till page 108, but they did. So you might find some stuff they're used, but they're in good condition. So there you go. Are you finding one, Donna?
I can't read that. I wrote down the page numbers, and I can't read them.
Oh no.
Well, I'm not sure what I have it is. On 94, gangs are factors of conditional love.
Mhm.
One false move and you find yourself outside. So then they'll get pressure. Somebody
Different consequences.
The unconditional love.
Yep.
Which makes it different.
I think one of the threads through this book is the office. People, kids and folks just walk in and the staff, Greg, they're all just like, hey, have some pizza. Hey, what? We'll get you a job. Hey, we'll listen to you. Yeah, you want to draw me? Draw me. Like that this office really sounds like this anti-gang. So the moment they walk in, they can see the difference.
Yeah. The AA,
Oh yeah.
they use previous addicts or alcoholics
Yeah.
to teach it.
Yeah.
Because if it was one of us going in there and teaching that, they wouldn't buy it.
Oh gosh, no.
So it has to be somebody that relates. And so I think this priest relates. For some reason or other, he relates to these guys, even though he never lived through it. That's what's surprising to me. That most people would not accept that.
Right.
Unless that person is in my shoes, walked in my shoes.
I think he had to build up to it. I think he had to earn it. Yeah.
But that's fascinating to me that he was not one of them.
Yeah.
and yet he was accepted, so.
Yeah. Now, I don't know if this still happens in schools, but we used to have school assemblies and they bring in a speaker. It'd be like about drugs or alcohol or whatever. Do they still do that?
No, I think so.
Okay. And it was usually somebody who lived through it. So don't join gangs. I was in a gang. Don't do drugs. I did drugs. But it usually is that sort of, I've been there, hear my story. They also usually would make you laugh and then get really serious, like, but yeah, again, it was,
Yeah, I've been there, done that, got the t-shirt, so I know where you're coming from. Empathy.
Yeah.
is what- but
well, let's do one more passage and then some discussion
One
questions.
thing I want to say,
Oh,
my
yeah.
daughter is teaching school apparently.
Mhm.
And she's not a full teacher yet.
Mm-hmm.
She's an assistant basically, but she's got her own room. She takes care of some
She's a
specially
teacher.
educated
She
kids.
absolutely is a teacher.
And one of the problems she has, she's been setting up her own library because if she was a full student teacher, she'd have her library already set up. But she's setting her own. And one of the problems she's run into as far as orientating to Black girls was that most of the books that they have in her library is that they have a bad relationship in the books that they get. In other words, it's a lot of. So what she's doing, she's buying books,
Mhm.
putting in her library that has a more of a wholesome content.
Yeah.
For these Black girls.
Yeah.
And she says the school system didn't do that. Everything that she's read so far has been negative.
I mean, maybe you've heard the phrase representation matters with TV and movies, and you might think to yourself, it's, it's a ploy or it's just whatever, or it's artificial, what have you. But it does make a difference. Like, I watched a Marvel movie, Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, right? Well, here's this Chinese guy from Toronto, Canada, who'd never really acted in a movie before, gets the part to play this Chinese superhero who's flipping all over the screen and doing this stuff. And some kid at home's gonna be like, I've only ever seen white superheroes before, maybe a couple of these others, but now I see one like that. Like, oh, maybe I can do some things. And then it might seem corny or Hollywood elite to do this stuff. I once heard a joke at an awards show. It's like, and now it's the everybody, it's the Everybody Matters dancers, and it was like everybody came out and everybody was a different color and a different gender and everything. It's like, representation. And they did it as a joke, but it really does have some power to it when you talk to kids and teachers who said, well, every book I ever read, nobody in it looked like me. Or the ones who looked like me always acted this way.
Yeah,
That
that's what,
doesn't
that's what she was
right.
saying. They have a negative connotation
Right.
to Black girls, so she's buying these books to teach them otherwise.
Yeah.
There's other avenues that you can go down.
Yeah, so it does make a difference because if it's been one way for generations, that starts to sink in.
A lot of educational testing has been accused of being biased. And when I was learning to be a teacher, I was a special education teacher, which is why Glenda really is a good teacher. She just is on a provisional license. The bias is there. You just, if you have lived with that bias your whole life, you don't see it as bias until you meet people who have such different experience. A child, I don't know, I always have thought of parents as being, these wonderful protector people. And it was, and I still haven't figured out how to handle the support of children, which I don't really have to do anymore since I'm not a full-time teacher. But my idea of a mother, my schema of a mother is somebody who loves you unconditionally, provides you. And this one child that I said, well, what about your mom? Had none of that. And it was like, it really was the eye-opening moment that, something so basic in my life that I've taken forever was lacking in not just that child's life, but and so, yeah, there is bias that, it's not intentional. And I think that's what I always kind of pushed against. Like, one of these trying to make this test biased.
It just is.
But the bias is still there. So testing populations of children and everybody but the white kids is doing more poorly, and the test was designed around white culture. well, is it more probable that the test is biased or that white people are just inherently better? The test was
And those
biased,
older countries, University of Iowa, they came out of the education.
Who?
I took Iowa tests when I was
Yeah.
a
Oh,
kid.
yeah, oh, I took that.
If you go to Iowa City, Iowa,
Yeah,
it's a different town, but they were Midwestern values, they were Midwestern terms, they were,
Oh,
when we
so
grew up, we didn't know we were prejudiced because.
No,
we didn't know
exactly.
anybody.
so
and
Liz,
you weren't prejudiced, you were just,
Naive.
really, yeah.
so Liz and I, we took preaching classes in seminary, and you get split into small groups so that you can kind of practice on each other and get feedback from your classmates and your peers. And then they bring in some retired pastors or professors to have extra bodies to help get through all the sermons. And I wasn't in the group, but she told me the story of one of, so Liz is from Florida, all right? Seminary was in Iowa. This was a culture shock. Not just the weather, but a lot of things, because Florida and Iowa are different.
Yeah, big time.
And one of her classmates got up and was preaching and said, "Oh, we've all heard the line, when the corn is as high as an elephant's eye."
And
And
she never heard it.
and one of the comments from almost everybody at the table was, "Yeah, not everybody knows that phrase." And a couple of them were like, "I have no idea what you're talking about right now," because there's no cornfields in Florida. They're like maybe like as a hobby. So just to check the bias, check your assumptions. Don't assume, that you know what somebody else is doing. However, you can assume that they are loved by God. That's not an assumption, that's a given. And so just changing the way you approach stuff and approach other people. I've talked about one of the things overall with this book is translating. So Greg got in there and got to know these folks and built up trust, and they treated him as though he was one of them. So it's a miracle. But he learned the language, he learned the lingo, he learned the culture. So how do we translate boundless compassion in our contexts is one of the things I've been talking about. Well, one of the things you can do is start by trying to see other folks as God sees and go from there. Don't start with the assumption that they are their pigeonhole or that they are whatever label you want to put on. Take a step back and just see them through God's eyes. And then go from there. Listen to them. Get to know them first. All right, one more passage, couple scriptures. Man, we have good conversations, and then we run out of time. Very last page of the chapter, 108. Usually his last paragraph is a nice way to sum it all up. Very last paragraph. I landed on the gospel that I wanted to use at his liturgy. This is one of those horrible stories where you get to know somebody and then they get just randomly gunned down. So I landed on the gospel that I wanted to use at his liturgy. Jesus says, "You are the light of the world." I like even more what Jesus doesn't say. He does not say, "One day, if you are more perfect and try really hard, you'll be light." He doesn't say, "If you play by the rules, cross your T's and dot your I's, then maybe you'll become light." This is from the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is just talking to these huge crowds. You are the light of the world, right? No, he says straight out, you are light. It's the truth of who you are, waiting only for you to discover it. So for God's sake, don't move. No need to contort yourself to be anything other than who you are. Jason was who he was. He made a lot of mistakes. He was not perfect. And his rage called the shots for a goodly chunk of his life. And he was the light of the world. He fit the description. It was supposed to be that he met the requirements for the job, but he came back and said, "Yeah, I fit the description like a suspect in something." So all these transformational stories. But loved as you are, and then God moves you from there. Passages this made me think of, I don't think these will come as a surprise. Romans 5, 6 to 11. For while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. Indeed, rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person, someone might actually dare to die. But God proves his love for us in that while we were sinners, still were sinners, Christ died for us. Much more surely then, now that we have been justified by his blood, will we be saved through him from the wrath of God. For if while we were sinners, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, much more surely, having been reconciled, will we be saved by his life. But more than that, we even boast in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we now have received reconciliation. And then 1 John 3, 1 to 3. See what love the Father has given us, that we should be called children of God. And that is what we are. That verse has always stuck with me. See what love the Father has given us, that we should be called children of God. That is what we are. Not after we were baptized and after, we cleaned up our act, we were called children. The reason the world does not know us is that it did not know him. Beloved, we are God's children now. What we will be has not yet been revealed. What we do know is this: when he is revealed, we will be like him, for we will see him as he is. And all who have this hope in him purify themselves just as he is pure. So the world doesn't know Jesus because the world doesn't understand Christians because they don't know Jesus. So if Christians aren't out there sharing this God, Jesus died for us while we were still sinners and enemies, then they're not going to really get to know Jesus. And if the Christians that they meet and hear on the radio and on TV are, here's a list of things you shouldn't be doing and why you're going to hell if you're doing them, shape up or ship out, then they're not really getting to know Jesus, who died for us while we were still sinners. Discussion questions. What role does, I don't like that one, come back to that. There is a study guide I found online, and some of their questions are good, and I try to write one down each week, but I really didn't like that one. So, who needs you to believe in them? You don't want to say it out loud, it's fine. But who needs you to believe in them right now?
Say that again?
Who right now in your life needs you to believe in
Yeah, for example.
them?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So who do you know who maybe is feeling that sacredness is foreign? Who needs to know that it isn't? Who needs you to believe in? And to go along with that, who makes you feel at home in your own skin? Especially if you mess up. Or maybe not right now, but in your life. Who was the Sunday school superintendent who bailed you out of juvenile detention and vouched for you? Who makes you feel comfortable in your own skin? Do you have any, I'll just read them. We're running out of time. Do you have any stories of love melting who you are not? Remember, it doesn't melt who you are, it melts away who you are not.
Think of one. My wife, when I was in the Navy, and I was just a peon E4 at the time. And my wife worked for this cosmetology company. And on Christmas Eve, we got invited to a Christmas party. And I get there, and I look around, and everybody's got couplings worth about $12,000 each. They're wearing top run clothes, and I really felt like Moby Dick on the water. I mean, I sat in the corner, kind of probably in the corner, and my wife was getting along with everybody because she knew them all, right? I didn't know any of them. They could bought and sold me any day they wanted to. Had nothing in common with any of them. And this man, about my age now, he was about 60 years old, go over and sat down next to me and asked me who I was. I said, well, I'm here with my wife, but she works for him, but I don't want, this is way out of my league. And he could see I was very uncomfortable. So he started talking to me and told me his name. He started talking about different things. And all of a sudden, all these people that shunned me, that wouldn't even come up and say hi when I walked the door, shake hands, they're all standing around us. Couldn't tell what was going on. And they all wanted to shake my hand and know who I was and everything. Turns out, and I found out later, that even though we were first name basis that night, turns out it was the CNO of Norfolk Naval Base.
Oh.
It was the big shot. Here, I'm an E4, right? And he knew I was, so he could tell, because I was wearing my uniform. It's the only dress clothes I had. So I was wearing my uniform, and he knew who I was. But he walked up and we were talking like that. He said, now, tomorrow if you see me, you better salute me. Tonight, we're just people. But he's the one that came over, could see what kind of condition I was in. I was really feeling very uncomfortable. Really did not belong there. Yeah. And he came over and sat, and all of a sudden, everybody else then started wondering who I was. Yeah. And why this admiral.
That was very kind.
And but I'll never forget that man. Yeah. He didn't know me from Adam. And here he was, an admiral of NOB. the largest naval base in the world, and he comes down and sits next to me and starts talking to me, see, I need some help.
Yeah.
That was probably, that will always relate to me. I'll never forget that.
I mean, think of that. Think of the grace you've received and the where you are in life right now, if you're doing all right. How can you use that? How can you use that power, that peace that you carry in your heart on maybe not every day, but the days where you got it? How can you use that to go sit with the E4 peon who looks out of place and bring them up? How can you do that to buy some books for your classroom to help these kids have a different picture of what could be? You know, how do you do that for your family members who maybe, despite all your best efforts, hit rock bottom or make some mistakes and it's out of your hands? Yeah. How do you respond in such a way that you melt away what they're not until they can kind of reclaim, oh yeah, this is who I want to be, this is who I am? Because there are those, and you know them, who are despondent, for whom both hope and their own sacredness seem entirely false. Yeah. I'll stop there. I got more, but I'll stop. Anybody else? All right, I have one comment and then a question for everybody. So the comment is, just look at the arc of this book so far. So we've gone from God, I guess, like, why do we do this? God, I guess. Disgrace, how people feel shame or worthlessness. Compassion, to put yourself there with them in that shame and disgrace. To say, no, we're in this together. And now water, oil, flame. Say, not only am I in here with you, but you're sacred and loved by God. And I'm going to sit with you until you can discover that for yourself too, until you can see what God sees. So that's been the arc of this book so far. Is why do we do this? Getting in with people where they're at, meeting them where they are, and helping them to see themselves the way God sees them. Again, how do you translate boundless compassion in this book in a very specific and intense context of gang violence into your lives? To the people who are lonely, to the people who would fill in the blank, whatever their problems are. How do you translate this approach into your life and your relationships right now? Whether it's strangers at MSEF or family members or what have you. How do you translate this compassionate approach to the folks in your life? That's your homework. And then a question. So next Sunday is June 3rd. We've got Pentecost worship outside. We won't have to have masks on outside for worship. So there's that. And we have the picnic afterwards. I plan to still have class next week. We'll do chapter 5. But here's the question. Do you want to keep going through the summer and just finish this book? Or do you want to take a break and then come back in the fall? Because I know, my kids won't have Sunday school, but they'll find something to do.
Are we changing our worship time as we have in the past?
Not this year.
Okay, so,
We haven't changed prayers since also.
Well, I mean, we're not doing the joint services this summer.
yeah, that's what I know we just do something different.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, not this year.
So, okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, then.
All right, so keep going until we finish the book.
Yeah.
All right, I will be off the 19th, so if you want to meet without me, that's fine. Otherwise, we'll just keep plugging along until we get through the book. All right, thank you, everybody.
Repeat your questions.
Repeat the questions.
How do you translate
Sure.
D?
How do you translate boundless compassion
Into your own life?
into your life? So how he does this in this book is very different situation, but I think the approach can be the same of getting to know somebody, listening to them, and sitting with them until they can see, treating them the way God sees them until they can see that too, if they don't.
Yeah, I didn't find out this guy was an admiral until the next day. And my wife came home from work. She said, you know who you were sitting with?
Yeah.
No, it's the admiral of MOB.
Yeah.
That's threw me a big loop, but I didn't know it that night.
That's like, Jesus on the road to Emmaus, he's talking to these two guys, and they have no idea what's going on. oh, wow. But how much more meaningful was it that he treated you the way he treated you without you knowing?
Especially when I found out who he was.
Yeah, yeah. So there you go. Maybe, you know, you all are ambassadors for Christ. You all are Jesus's disciples in this world, called and commissioned to do his work. And so maybe folks don't always realize that you're being kind to them because you're a Christian. Maybe you don't lead with that if you think that would, you know, scare them off or you know, trigger some bad experiences with Christianity they've had. Maybe you do lead with being a Christian. That's what you got to figure out. What is their situation? Get to know them, treat them the way God would treat them until maybe they can pick up on that. That is the next chapter is called slow work. That is the slow work of evangelism. A lot of folks want evangelism programs where you show up and be like, hey, look at us, you know, come, the big tent revival, come on in. But really, evangelism, I think, is usually slow work. And that's not as flashy. But
You
that's
get a
what
lot
we
of
do.
converts, but they don't stick.
Sure, yeah, it's the seeds on the patch. Okay, I'm going to sign off. Thank you, everybody, for watching at home. See you next time.